Every door, drawer, and box lid needs a handle, knob, or a pull. Sure, you can buy those commercially made, but wouldn't you rather custom make your own? I'm going to show you how to make 3 types of handles for any kind of project. This is a bead and cove handle, and by that we mean we have a bead around the top edge with a small fillet, and then we undercut a cove from the bottom side up to that fillet. Here's how we make those cuts. To route the bead, we're going to use a 1/8 inch radius beading bit. To route the cove, we use either a 1/2 inch or a 3/8 inch round nose bit. Choose whichever profile you prefer. I've machined my handle blank to size. Make your handles whatever size is proportional to your project. So because this is a small piece, I want to be able to route that safely. I'm going to hold it in a small parts holder that lets me do that with, it keeps my hands free away from the bit. You can also use a wooden hand screw clamp to do that. So I've got the beading bit in the router, and I want to set the height so that it'll cut a perfect bead that zeroes out on the bottom, which this will end up being the top face, but I don't want to leave a shoulder or a little fillet here, so I want that bead to round out perfectly along that edge. When I route this small piece, I want to route the ends first and then the edges to avoid tear out, because when you route along end grain, there's a little bit of tear out here on the edge, but then that following cut down the edge takes care of that and gets rid of it. So I want to do ends first, then edges. You could also do end edge, but because my small parts holder here, I don't want to have to keep going from a narrow setup to a wide to a narrow to a wide. I just do both ends first, then do the edges. I've got the beading bit in the router, and I want to make that cut in 2 passes. I don't want to just take it all at once because it might burn a little or make some tear out unnecessarily. So the way to do that, because I'm going to route against the bearing, the way to keep and limit my first cut is by using the fence as my stop. So I'm going to actually bring my fence out past the bearing so that about half the cutters are showing. And that way I can just route against the fence and take a small cut there all the way around, and then I'll move the fence back. With your handle blank held in the small parts holder, anchor the far end of the holder against the fence, pivot into the bit, and then route right to left. For the second pass, I move the fence away from the bearing and then guide the piece against the bearing, not the fence. Now we have our bead routed around the top with the fillet underneath. I have my round nose bit installed to cut the cove, and I want to set the height so that the top of the bit intersects the fillet just perfectly. And then I'll cut about halfway into the blank. Take shallow passes as you cut this so to avoid tear out. Move the fence back for each pass about a 1/16 of an inch and route all the way around. Stop when there's no more material being removed and the cut is a clean intersection with the fillet. So now my handle is routed. I've got my bead, I've got my undercut cove. Now I just need to do a little touch-up sanding and it's ready to go. I'll just attach this to my door, drawer, box lid with some screws, and we're all there. This is a bracket and arch handle. We've got 2 brackets and then the arch piece. The brackets will cut on the table saw. We'll rip a groove down the center and then cut the arch, the spline piece to fit in the middle as the handle. We'll cut the arch on the bandsaw with a pattern that we've provided, and then we'll drive a dowel in here to hold the brackets to the handle and screw it to your drawer or box lid, and you're all finished. To start, we'll make a bracket blank. Rip a blank for the brackets. It's 3/4 inch thick by 1 1/4 inch wide and about 6 to 10 inches long. With the blade height set at 13/16 inches, rip a centered 1/4 inch groove down the length of the blank. To do this, set the blade just offside of center, rip a groove the full length, flip the board around, and rip another groove to create a perfectly centered 1/4 inch groove. Square up the end of the bracket blank and then cross-cut 2 1-inch long segments. Using a thin rip jig on the table saw, I cut a piece for the arch, and then I check for a snug fit in the groove of the brackets. I apply the arch pattern to the blank with spray adhesive and bandsaw and sand it to shape. I glue the brackets onto the arch using a combination square to keep an equidistant spacing from the ends. Clamp them, and then I wipe away any glue squeeze out. Now I drill 1/4-inch holes in each of the brackets that intersect through the handle. Then I glue a dowel in each hole, cut them flush with a flush trimming saw, and trim them up with a block plane. Now I sand the brackets flush to match the arch of the handle. When you're mounting this arched handle to a box lid or a drawer front, getting the pilot holes into the brackets can be tricky because the arch is taller than the brackets. So how do you get this to stay flat so you can get a perpendicular hole? The trick I've learned is use the remaining part of your bracket blank, put your handle in there upside down with the arch down inside. Now you've got this perfectly perpendicular and stable. Then take it to your drill press, drill your pilot holes as needed. Then install it and you're good to go. This is an inset and beaded arch handle that you make with 2 simple jigs, 3 bits to create this handle that you glue into a mortise on your project. For the mortising jig, I start with a 4x9 piece of 1/2-inch plywood, lay out the center hole, and then drill a 1 3/4-inch hole in the center. Then at the router table, I install a 1/2-inch spiral bit, set a stop so that I can cut a slot 1 inch to each side of the center hole, and then route that slot. I flip the slot over and complete it for the other side. Now that my jig is finished, to make it easier to remove after double face taping it to our lid blank, I'm going to route a rabbet along the ends just so that I can get a screwdriver in there to make it easy to pop off. For the cradle jig, I start with a piece of laminated MDF that's 1.5 inches thick, 2 inches wide, and about 18 inches long. I adhere the full-size arch pattern with some spray adhesive. I bandsaw the arch to shape and then sand it smooth on the spindle sander. I transferred the center line across the arch, and then I sanded a shallow recess on the back side at the center line to allow for shank clearance on our router bit. I transfer the center marks down the insides of the cutout on the mortising jig. I draw center lines on my workpiece, in this case the lid. I apply double face tape to the mortising jig and adhere it to the lid, centering it on the lines. Make your lid or your drawer front or your door to size and have it ready to go for the mortise. Now let's route the mortise. To mortise the lid, we'll use a 3/8-inch guide bushing in a router with a 1/4-inch spiral bit. This allows me to transfer the pattern into the lid by routing. The cutting depth needs to equal the height of the stem on the handle. To set that depth, place your router on the jig, lower it until the bit touches the workpiece. That zeroes it out. Move your turret stop to the lowest setting, and then measure from that lowest setting to the bottom of your stop rod. Then go back 1 stop higher, and you're ready to route. Route this in shallow increments to avoid breaking the bit. Now we're ready to make the handles. To start with, I'll make blanks for the handles at 5/8 inches thick, 3 1/8 inches long, and then about 5 to 6 inches wide. That can vary a little bit. Make multiples of these. Depending on how many handles you want to make that many. We'll get 2 handles out of each blank, so if you're making a dresser and you need 10, make about 6 or 8 of them just to make sure you've got some extras. And also, make some test blanks out of some scrap material. I've got some of poplar here, because you'll need to make test cuts at multiple stops in the operation. So I like to work with a piece this size because it not only keeps my hands safely away from the bits, but like I said, it lets me get 2 handles from each blank. So here's a finished one where all I've got left to do is to cut the handles away. So I make the handles with 1 bit, a 1/8 inch radius half round bit that cuts a radius here, and it also has cutters on the top. So with this bit, I can cut the bead around the top here. So we'll cut a bead first. Then we will undercut what I call the stem using the top cutters, and then we'll rotate it and I'll undercut the ends. And what that does is it gives me a little bit of an extension that'll cover our mortise. When we glue it in place on the lid or on the drawer front, that will cover the rounded part of the mortise. And then when we're done, we'll just cut these away. So let's get this installed in the router table and get to work. I'll use the cradle jig to transfer the arch onto the handle blanks. Mark the center point at the top and the bottom of each handle blank. Use one of the handle blanks lying next to the cradle jig to elevate each piece for marking. Stand a handle blank next to the cradle jig with the center points aligning, and then mark the curve with a pencil. To do the first operation, the bit has to be safely tucked away inside of a sacrificial fence. So make one that's about the same length as your cradle jig, so in this case about 18 to 20 inches, roughly 6 inches tall, and then cut a notch out for the bit. Secure it to the router table fence with double-face tape. So I want to move the router table fence now forward until my sacrificial fence aligns with the back of the radius on the router bit. Secure the cradle jig to the table with double-face tape centered on the bit. Set the bit height so that the bottom of the radius zeroes out flush at the center point of the cradle jig. Make test cuts with your test pieces. Adjust the bit height until you've got a perfect round over. Then move on to your work pieces. Lower the bit height until it matches the depth of the groove. Position the fence so the back of the cutter intersects the groove but doesn't cut up into the bead. Hold the handle blank down against the table with one hand and tight against the cradle jig with the other as you rotate through the cut. Remove the cradle jig from the fence, but don't change the bit height setting. Put a miter gauge in the miter slot and attach an auxiliary fence that extends past the bit, and then route a shallow notch through that auxiliary fence. Align the bottom of the bead with the notch closest to the fence. With the handle blank resting against the auxiliary fence, insert a small sliver of wood into the notch that has a straight edge and press it against the far end of the notch. And then slide the handle blank until the bottom of the bead rests against that sliver of wood. Hold the piece and clamp it to the fence. Now clamp a stop block to the fence up against the handle blank to ensure repeated accuracy for all the other handles. Now we're ready to cut the handles away from each blank. The height of the stem needs to equal the depth of the mortise that we cut earlier in our lid. So I measure the depth of the mortise, and then I transfer that measurement to my table saw cutoff sled, mark it, and then I align the bottom of the bead with that mark, clamp the blank, and cut it away. Now we're ready to fit our handle to the lid, but as you can see, our mortise has rounded ends and the handle stem has square ends. So rather than try to square off this mortise, which could be more difficult, I'll round off the ends of the stem with a chisel and some sandpaper. Do any touch-up sanding as needed, and then when you're ready to install, apply some glue to the bottom of the stem, insert it into the mortise, and press to fit. Well, that puts a lid on this technique. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration as much as I enjoyed making them. Now take this technique and customize your own projects.